Hi, welcome. Well, we've got another lecture here. This one should be a bit shorter than the prior one on Danilou. This is on Dawson and his 6 Ages of the Church. It's a great little piece. It's foundational for everything we do here at UMary in Catholic Studies. But it refers to a lot of things that Dawson just expects his readers to know cold. Names and events, stuff, some of which you might know well and some of which you might never have heard. So what I want to do, instead of walking you through all the 6 ages and that sort of thing, you're smart enough to read the handouts that are given to you as PDFs on the website. What I want to do is just talk about a few things here and there in Dawson's piece to give you a little bit of purchase and a broader perspective. Okay, first of all, Dawson divides Christian history, Catholic history, into these great 6 ages. He prefers that to simply ancient, medieval, and modern, because that common threefold distinction of ancient, medieval, and modern does not do justice to the diversity and the dynamism of the church in any given age, or its continuity. And here you see continuity, right? If you think ancient, medieval, and modern, it's like you've got 3 churches. The ancient church, which was kind of good, the medieval church, which was bad, and then the modern church, which takes a few things from the ancient church, gets rid of the medieval church, and then sees itself as the best form of the church. So for these reasons, Dawson wants to avoid that ancient, medieval, modern distinction and talk about these 6 ages, which each show a continuing pattern. I think this is really good stuff. He says in each of these 6 patterns, right, you've got a threefold process. You've got a period of intense spiritual activity, right? You've got a new situation, and it produces a new apostolate. An apostolate is like new missionary activity, new thinking, new work for the gospel, that sort of thing. Right? Then that period of intense activity achieves something. You've got a period of achievement, a new Christian culture with new art, new forms, new beauties, new glories, that sort of thing. But, right, as always seems to happen in life, a period of achievement is followed by a period of retreat. There's some sort of attack, usually external, but sometimes internal, right? Because achievement has brought about complacency and made the church perhaps weak inside, and thus attacks from without or sometimes within precipitate loss, and then the cycle starts again, right? So crisis, growth, decay, intense spiritual activity, achievement, retreat. You see this in these 6 ages, except for the first. He makes that pretty clear, because that's a special case with Jesus and the apostles and what have you. Okay, now on pages 48 and 49 of Dawson's text, he mentions Constantine the Great, the emperor, and a certain heresy. That heresy is Arianism. First of all, let's talk a little bit about Constantine the Great. Here's his story if you don't know it. Let's back up a bit and talk more about the Roman Empire. Christianity is a fully Jewish phenomenon. I'll come to that shortly as well, that becomes a Gentile phenomenon, largely Gentile phenomenon. But it's not a religion that the Roman Empire can readily just integrate or accept. Because Christianity is Jewish, idolatry, the worship of false gods or the worship of statues and images and that sort of thing, is right out. Now, Romans, being polytheists, had many gods, and they liked their many gods, and when they conquered other cultures, they let other cultures keep their gods too. It's like, hey, we've got Jupiter, whom the Greeks call Zeus, and you've got whoever you've got, if you're the Armenians or the Parthians or whoever, just keep them too. Many gods, you can call on whatever god you need at a specific time, and it's just fine, right? Gods are non-competitive generally in polytheistic religion. Well, that's a problem. Jews have one God, right? The great Shema in Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. No other gods before him whatsoever. One God. 10 Commandments. You shall not make a graven image of anything. You shall not bow down and worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So for Jews and then Christians, there's one God alone, and you can't worship or honor any others whatsoever. To do so means that you've forsaken the faith and you're done. Stick a fork in me, that sort of thing. Well, what this means is from the beginning until 313, 305, see why 313 in a moment, the church is often persecuted. Sometimes it's regional and sporadic. Other times, however, the church is persecuted empire-wide. And those are the great persecutions you hear about, right? Like the Diocletian persecution. Being that as it may, Christianity is not legal, not licit, not permitted for about 2.5 centuries from Jesus until Constantine. But here's what happens then with Constantine. There are 4 claimants to the imperial throne. And eventually what happens is you're down to 2. Constantine rivals a guy named, Maxentius, I believe. Maximian, I think it's Maxentius. It's Maxentius. In the year 310. They both want to be emperor. Well, they're getting ready to go to battle. And this battle will take place in northern Rome on the Tiber at a place called the Milvian Bridge. The Milvian Bridge. And it's common to go into battle having picked a god to go into battle with you. And so, if you're a polytheist. And so Constantine is up the night before the battle, wondering which god he should invoke to help him go into battle. And so the story goes, he sees a sign in the sky of a cross. And the story is told in Latin, although Constantine would have seen it, heard it, known it in Greek. The inscription was, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign you will conquer. In this sign you will conquer. The sign of the cross. So Constantine has a cross in the form of a chiral, right, with a little loop on top, and what looks like an X. Has that painted on his soldiers' shields. And they go into battle the next day against Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and lay waste to Maxentius' armies. And so Constantine has won, pretty much the last man standing. He gets to be emperor, and he says to himself, whoa, there might be something to this Jesus fellow. Because, he had this vision, went into battle, and there you go. So what happens then in 313, Constantine makes Christianity and other religions licit religions, not illicit, but licit. Christianity becomes tolerated, permitted. The document is called the Edict of Milan in 313 and provides for empire-wide religious toleration. Jews already had privileges, but they maintained those privileges to worship as they say fit. Polytheists, pagans of various stripes can practice their religion, and now Christianity becomes a permitted religion. Not the official religion yet. Okay, that doesn't happen until way later in the 300s. Constantine does not make Christianity the official religion of the empire. He makes it a licit and permitted religion. Now, his mother becomes Saint Helena, right? She goes to the east, brings back all these relics from the east, brings them to Rome. You can see many of them to this day in the Roman churches. If you ever go to Rome, you should. Constantine starts favoring the church. The church is now a rising power. It's got imperial favor. Constantine himself practices as a Christian, but he's not baptized until he's on his deathbed. 2 reasons. 1, he didn't want to alienate his pagan subjects by going through with baptism. Number 2, a lot of people delayed baptism if they were sitting on the fence till the end of their lives because they were worried if they sinned after baptism they'd go to hell and be lost forever. That might have been what's motivating Constantine as well. It's the emperor, intrigue, he's got to kill a lot of people. It's just kind of how it goes, right? So he probably postpones baptism until he's on his deathbed so he can not sin after baptism. Anyway, that's Constantine in a nutshell, and just how significant he is for Western history. That vision In this sign you will conquer, right? Kind of set the agenda to this very day, the way a lot of Christians kind of conceive of their faith, with church and state tightly intertwined. Okay, then let's talk about this heresy that's mentioned on page 48. That heresy is Arianism, founded by a guy named Arius, A-R-I-U-S. Has nothing to do with Nazis or that sort of thing. Arius in English, is the founder of this heresy. And he is from Alexandria, and he teaches that the Son of God in the Trinity isn't really fully God, but rather was the first thing that God the Father created. So the Son of God was created, according to Arius. Okay? Well, that's a problem, because Christians worship the Son of God, Jesus, right, as God. And you can't, as a Jew or a Christian, worship anything created, right? That's idolatry. That's like praying to statues, worshiping statues. Right? We Catholics pray at statues. That's something different. So Arius, he's got a position that makes sense, right? If you read the Bible, it gets kind of confusing. You know, Father, Son, and Spirit all seem to be God in some way. It's much simpler just to have one God, right? God the Father, and that's it. And then to do something else with the Son and the Spirit or anyone else. That's what Arius is trying to do, make religion simple, rational, reasonable. And his opponent is a guy named Athanasius. His name means immortal in Greek, Athanasius. And he also is from Alexandria. And he thinks Arius' heresy is, well, heretical. It's a horrible thing. So there are basically two camps, Arius and Athanasius. And their supporters, you know, in the early 300s, are fighting in the streets pretty much. People died. They'd go to bars and they would sing songs about their leaders' respective doctrines. Arius had a famous jingle, "If you want your doctrine, I can give it to you hot and hot. There once was a time when the Son of God was not." Meaning, again, because there was a time when the Son was not, that means the Son was created. You know, something the one God, the Father, created in time. So people would sing these songs with a little bit of ancient beer in them, go into the streets, and they'd riot with the other camp, and people died. It was vicious and brutal. And so Constantine now steps in. Okay, remember, he's kind of become formal, well, he's become the emperor practically in 310, issues the Edict of Milan in 313, and the church is in turmoil over this question of whether the Son of God was fully God or just kind of like God because he was created by God. It's precipitating riots and division. And Constantine says this, "Disorder in the church, I fear more than any war. The church is a rising power. It's becoming the religion of the empire, especially with imperial favor. Everybody wants to be on the emperor's good side, and so they start investigating Christianity. And now the church is rent in two." So Constantine decides to call a council at Nicaea, Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, and 200 plus bishops get together for this great ecumenical council. It's the first of the four great ecumenical councils. And the question isn't whether Jesus as the Son of God was God, but how the Son of God's divinity was to be understood. How the Son of God's divinity was to be understood. Was the Son of God fully God or just like God? So Arius proposes a word, homoiousios. Homoiousios, with a little iota in there, the letter I. Means of like substance, of similar substance. The Son of God isn't fully God, but of similar substance with God the Father. And Athanasius is having none of this. And so he, with Constantine's support, proposes the word homoousios. There's no iota, there's no I in there. Homoousios. Same substance, identical substance. The Son of God is fully God. You ever hear the English phrase, "it doesn't make an iota's bit of difference"? Here, that iota is the difference between idolatry and true worship, between heresy and orthodoxy. Right? Well, Athanasius got the better of the debate. Right? There's all kinds of problems with worshiping something that's not fully God. And so most of the bishops there vote in favor of Athanasius' position, and the matter settled. Except that it's not. Heresy dies hard, and a lot of bishops for some decades, maybe even a couple centuries, were quite content to actually be Arians. St. Jerome has this famous phrase that the world groaned to wake up and discover itself Arian, even after the Council of Nicaea. And Athanasius, for his part, suffers exile 5 different times at the hands of rulers, emperors, who are sympathetic to Arianism. Okay, so just a little bit about that. Then on page 48, Dawson brings up the fact that there are Jews and Gentiles in the church, and the church becomes Gentile. This is crucial. It comes back to continuity. Jesus was Jewish, and early Christianity is a fully Jewish phenomenon. Christianity is Judaism plus Jesus. Now, of course, when Jesus comes, that means a lot of tweaks to older things, like in the Sermon on the Mount, other things Jesus says. A lot of the Jewish law is done away with. A lot of it is kept. But Jesus doesn't just drop out of the sky, out of nothing, and start giving a brand new religion. Right? Rather, Jesus assumes Jewish culture and mores in Scripture, and those things still stand unless Jesus expressly changes them. So sometimes you'll get people saying, well, Jesus never said anything about issue X or issue Y or issue Z. And that, in many ways, once you think about it, is fairly silly. Jesus doesn't start from scratch. Jesus assumes Judaism and the Jewish culture. And so if he doesn't talk about something, he's not changing it, but rather accepting it. Accepting it. Okay? So, I bring that up because there's a lot of confusion on this point. Christians again and again and again have wanted to make Jesus into a Norwegian, wanted to make Jesus into a German, an Icelander, whatever. Something other than Jewish. But Jesus was fully Jewish, and Christianity is a Jewish phenomenon. Right? Okay. It's just important to know then what happens in the first couple of centuries is that early Christianity becomes largely Gentile in terms of its racial ethnic composition. Becomes largely Gentile. Why that is? Well, there's various reasons. Missionary activity to the Gentiles succeeds because Gentiles are really open to a lot of new ideas, whereas Jews in general are pretty conservative, and the idea of a crucified Messiah just doesn't register. The Messiah is supposed to destroy the Romans, not be crucified by the Romans. The Christian story is bizarre to Jews, and that's why I think in 1 Corinthians Paul talks about how the death and resurrection of the Messiah Jesus is a scandal, a stumbling block to Jews. It just doesn't register. It makes no sense to them. But you can present Jesus and his resurrection in such a way to pagans, to Gentiles, in a way that they will accept it. Okay, let's move on then. On page 58, okay, Dawson says something really fascinating. Middle of page 58 talks about what it means to be a historian. Whereas the secular historian is in no way committed to the cultures of the past, right? He's saying you can write a history of Egypt, a history of Rome, a history of America, whatever, right? The Catholic, and indeed every Christian, is bound to recognize the existence of a transcendent supra-temporal element at work in history. Now, you don't know this yet, probably, if you've never had a course on the philosophy of history, but he's touching on something that's really crucial, that's debated among historians in history departments, this sort of thing. There's 2 kinds of historians, essentially, and the first kind is really dominant. There are historians who are merely recorders of the past. Maybe that's not totally fair, but they want to know what happened, why it happened, and they might do a little bit with its significance for today. So what happened in Rome? Well, Caesar was assassinated. Why did it happen? Well, because of this. What were its effects? Well, these several things. Okay, well, how does that shape Europe and America? Right, because we all inherit the Roman Empire. That's kind of like the history as you kind of think of it. But there's a second kind of history, a second kind of historian. There is what we call speculative philosophers of history, speculative historians. And these are people like St. Augustine, who said, here's what's really going on in history from God's own perspective, right? History is God's story. It's his story, right? God's purposes are working their way out in history, and here's what God is doing. I mean, you go to a historian in your average history department, they wouldn't dare say something like that. Like, well, we could talk about, Rome and why things happened in the Roman Empire and how that affects us, or why things happened in Britain and how that affects us, but we can't say, that God or spirit or something is like working in that. So Augustine is this great speculative philosopher of history. And he speculates, and he believes it, just kind of thinking out loud, but he really believes it, that God is directing history to God's purposes through the church. Modern speculative philosophers of history would be people like Hegel. If you've ever studied philosophy, Hegel is a speculative philosopher of history, as well as Toynbee and Spengler. This really isn't popular nowadays, especially in a postmodern context where people are just terrified of meaning because supposedly if you believe something has meaning, then you're going to fight for it, and thus it leads to violence. So it's a minority kind of position, but it used to be kind of the majority, and serious historians used to think this way as well. Augustine, Toynbee, Spengler, Hegel. History has a purpose, driven by God or by the Spirit, this sort of thing, right? So just be aware of that. When Dawson does history, right, he's doing what we'd call speculative history. He believes God works in history and that God is directing human history. Okay, that might not get you hired in a whole lot of history departments today, but it's how he says, if you believe in God as a Catholic, you need to think about history because God is real and God acts. Okay, just a few other minor things. Pages 52 and following, Dawson talks about this rural shift you get in Northern Europe and Scandinavia and Britain, right? In Europe, mainland Europe, Southern Europe, right, it's about the bishop and the city, but when Christianity spreads north, the monastery takes center place because everything's much more rural, right? And it was the monasteries, starting with St. Benedict. You Mary is a Benedictine institution, right? We're very sensitive to this here. It was the monasteries that preserved human learning and culture in the West from about, say, 500 to 1000 AD, roughly. In the monasteries, people were taught to read. In the monasteries, Benedictine monks and sisters, like St. Hildegard of Bingen, she's a bit later, were exploring the world and engaging what we would call natural science and medicine and this sort of thing. So the monasteries really saved culture through half a millennium, what we sometimes call the Dark Ages, after the Roman Empire in the West kind of falls apart. Another thing I want to say, pages 53 and 54, Dawson talks about reform. Here I simply want to say, he doesn't really touch on it, but it's important. The Reformation, right, Luther, Calvin, the Protestant Reformation, is not something that just springs out of nowhere. Christianity in the West became a mess in the 13 and 1400s. Right? If you've seen, the Borgias or any of that history, it's just a royal mess. Popes and cardinals have children and mistresses. The Vatican is a real disaster. Things are just a mess. Heck, the papacy moves to France because it's nicer for a time. The so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy, right? And St. Catherine of Siena pops out and says that, you popes, you've got to get yourself back to Rome. It's ridiculous that the Bishop of Rome is living in France, right? So it's just an embarrassment to serious churchmen and churchwomen. And so reformers rise up. Earlier than the 1300s, of course, you get St. Francis of Assisi and his partner Clare and the Poor Clares. You get other reforming movements that are a little less concerned with the orthodox structures of the church. Some of them are heretical, some are not. My point in this is that the Protestant Reformation can be seen within this broad swath between, say, 1300 and even earlier to about 1700, kind of right in the middle of that, starting in the 1500s. Not something that just springs up, but something that has antecedents, The difference is Luther and Calvin are quite willing to throw the Pope overboard, and they've got the political support to do so. Other people that tried that earlier got burned at the stake, and worse. So, the Protestant Reformation as a subset of broader reform over 4, 5, 6 centuries. The other thing I will say, on page 56, Dawson starts talking about the Revolution. I'm a fairly new Catholic, and I've been thinking about it for a long time and learning about being Catholic for a long time, but I'm fairly new. And it struck me that part of my process of becoming Catholic involved learning just how much people were on the defensive, or Catholics were on the defensive in human history, because the way the modern world, or Protestants sometimes historically, our brothers and sisters have told the story, is that the Catholic Church is this big, bad, medieval, monolithic monstrosity that's got to be crushed because it's just oppressive and nasty and boo, right? This sort of thing. The Pope is Darth Vader. The Pope is the New York Yankees. This sort of thing. Sorry, I don't like the Yankees. Anyway, but once I got into it, you realize, once you actually read the history, that, Catholics in the Catholic Church have been really on the run. Just to take the modern period, in the French Revolution, there's a region of France called the Vendée, and it was royalist, supported the king, and it was Catholic. And the revolutionaries go in there and end up killing about 400,000 men, women, and children. Some scholars, some historians think that's the first genocide in history. Or if you think of what the English under Henry VIII and his successors did to the Irish and to Catholics as well, it was really brutal. We speak about Bloody Mary Tudor, the Catholic queen who tried to restore Catholicism in England. But her successor Elizabeth, although she had a longer reign, killed a lot of people too. We could be talking about Bloody Elizabeth. It's what rulers do, Protestant or Catholic, right? They kill people. Back in the day at least. You think about the church in China nowadays, undergoing persecution. Even Catholics in the United States were hated and routinely hated, viciously hated, until Kennedy becomes president in 1950. And now, again, we're kind of being hated again because Catholics take stances on things like marriage and life issues that aren't very popular right now. Mexico, if you've seen the film For Greater Glory, basically the movie version of a lot of true history, where the government of Mexico decided to declare war on the Catholic Church and basically try to eliminate it. A lot of people brutally killed in this period. Or in Germany in the 1870s under Otto von Bismarck, for whom the city of Bismarck is named, about 2 years before he started his own war on the Catholic Church, in German the Kulturkampf. Bismarck basically was a serious Protestant Christian, and he wanted to minimize Catholic influence in German life, and so through the series of May laws in the mid-1870s, he essentially severely restricted, if not outlawed, the practice of Catholicism. In 1876, every single Prussian, that's a region in Germany where Berlin is, every single Prussian bishop was either in jail or exiled. And about 1,400 priests were in jail for being Catholic. One of these laws also that was passed required that every single clergyman, whether Catholic or Protestant, be educated in a state school in Germany. That's why to this day in Germany you've got a Protestant faculty in every institution and a Catholic faculty in every state institution, right? Two separate faculties. So anyway, it's interesting to me to learn just how much pressure the church has been under, the Catholic Church has been under historically. We're not always the bad guys. In fact, often, we've suffered. Doesn't excuse some of the things that Catholics have done or the Catholic Church as such has done in history. There's another side to this story. We've often been on the receiving end of a lot of oppression in Europe, in America. So, Dawson in a nutshell. It would do you well to master both Dawson and Danelu, not only for the purposes of this class, but for your education at UMary and whatever else you do with Catholic studies. Take care, and God bless.